The Singapore Grand Prix was an absolutely wild weekend, and it all started with Red Bull's complete lack of performance. We could spend at least an hour talking about the genius of Carlos Sainz and his incredible weekend, but that could never have happened if Red Bull had been at their usual standard. There's a lot that could have caused it. The new rules limiting flexi wings and floors maybe. Perhaps the track just wasn't suited to them. Or have the rest finally caught up? Or perhaps it was a combination of all three that was required to take them down. Let's find out. This weekend was as bad as Red Bull have had for 2 seasons. The only race weekend they've scored less points since the introduction of the ground effect cars last season was at the first race of 2022, when they had a double engine failure. Doesn't that feel like a long time ago now? If George Russell hadn't inexplicably lost his second podium of the season in the dying corners of the race, it would have been Red Bull's worst Sunday performance since that same weekend. Since that Bahrain Grand Prix, when Ferrari made themselves early favourites for the 2022 title, Red Bull have only not featured on the podium in 2 races. Brazil 2022 and this weekend's Singapore Grand Prix. Before Singapore, they had featured on the podium 50 times in 35 races. So what on earth happened at the Marina Bay this weekend? The Friday wasn't great. Max went 3rd fastest in an unrepresentative FP1 and Sergio managed 7th fastest in FP2 but was only 7/10 off the time of Carlos Sainz, who topped every session but FP1. Red Bull have had a few dodgy Fridays this season. Max is regularly complaining about downshifts and upshifts, saying this or that is unacceptable. Every time though, Red Bull have turned it around, fixed the issue overnight, and come qualifying, Max has been relatively comfortable, even with Red Bull sacrificing some single lap speed for race pace. That didn't happen though. Saturday was actually worse, with the eventual pole lap being 1.2 seconds faster than Red Bull's best qualifying lap, though the lack of attendance to Q3 may have affected that. In the race, the pace was better, but beating the half-upgraded McLaren of Oscar Piastri isn't a bright side when you've won every race this season. After the race, Christian Horner said, "At some point we were going to get beaten. 15 in a row is an unbelievable record," said Horner. "We've only been beaten once prior to tonight since last July, and I have to congratulate Ferrari and particularly Carlos, who drove a very strong race today and deserved to win the race. And at the same time, we've narrowed in on both championships, which we have a chance of winning the Constructors in Japan next weekend. There is no getting away from that truth. Red Bull have still dominated this season. We have said all season that the gap would close, and it has, but in Singapore, there was a drastic shift in fortunes for the team. This wasn't a closing of the gap. Ferrari filled the gap with asphalt and did donuts on it. Was it perhaps the clampdown on flexible body parts this weekend that harmed Red Bull then? Flexible wings were a focus in the lead up to the weekend, as the FIA said enough is enough with TD18. There was still a few on show, but the flexing was noticeably decreased. There was also an update to TD39 from last season, which stopped teams abusing flexible floors to hide the fact they were dragging their cars on the track surface. That was a directive that ended Ferrari's title challenge last year but made no difference to Red Bull. Despite the timing of Red Bull's struggles coming exactly when these new TDs came into play, they aren't to blame. Or at least they aren't completely to blame. No more flexing wings was thought to cost the worst offenders a 10th of a second in lap time, and the floor test changes were minor as well. In fact, Red Bull team boss Christian Horner was adamant the squad has made 0 changes to its car as a result of the new FIA stance. Asked to explain the details about what went wrong, Horner said, "It's all engineering stuff. There's no silver bullets in this business. I know all of you would love to blame the TD, but unfortunately we can't even blame that, because it's not changed a single component on our car. Red Bull were pretty much the only team to not change their car in Singapore, so we can't argue with that. Even if they did make changes, they wouldn't have had this meteoric an effect." Rather than Red Bull's difficulties being linked to the TDs, Horner instead suggested the trigger for its struggles in qualifying were related to setup, with the team having got it badly wrong from the off in Friday practice. "We knew coming here it would be expected to have a closer competition," he said. "But I think it took us a bit by surprise, just how far out we were on Friday. I think that we were just not in the right operating window for the car, particularly over a single lap. And when you're not there, then the tyres feel horrible. Everything just doesn't work." This is something that Singapore is known for. When teams have had incredible, basically unbeatable cars in the past, the streets of the Marina Bay circuit have been the one to trip them up. In 2015, when Mercedes finished 1st and 2nd in 12 of the 19 races, they could only manage 4th place in a retirement. In 2019, Singapore again denied Mercedes a podium, the only race that season that they didn't get a podium finish when both cars made it to the checkered flag. What is it about Singapore then that does this? I think maybe our simulation before the weekend didn't lead us to the right conclusion, and then you have to sort of unravel your way out of that, Horner said. We just ended up in the wrong window, and it exposed some of our weaknesses that the car has. It has actually been a very useful lesson for next year because it gives us a very useful insight on certain things that hopefully we can address in the RB20. This weakness that Singapore exposed could be the same one that we glimpsed at Spa earlier this year. I know Red Bull finished first and second at the Belgian Grand Prix, but there was a surprise in their performance. They were backing off the accelerator pedal through the famous Eau Rouge in the race to avoid the car bottoming out too much. This was a symptom of their suspension setup, which I'll explain. One of the core strengths of the RB19 has been its ability to maintain a predictable aero platform at various speeds, so it's more consistent through different types of corners. The squad's effective ride control also allows the car to run close to the ground at high speed, where the most downforce is produced without bouncing. Remember, they were the only team to not suffer from porpoising from the start of 2022. With a relatively high stationary ride height, this suggests the car runs with a soft suspension. That same soft suspension that has helped them be so good this year causes problems at a bumpy track. The ride height was constantly changing, causing the amount of downforce the underbody was creating to constantly fluctuate, unsettling the car. Both Red Bulls lacked grip all weekend. Max Verstappen even said he would win a drift race but could do nothing in a Formula 1 race. Could Red Bull have avoided this? Absolutely. But like Christian Horner said, something in their pre-race simulations was off. That is the huge mistake that caught them out. Formula 1 teams can easily replace suspension parts. They often change the stiffness or even the entire coils during practice sessions, but Red Bull just didn't have the answer at the track. If they were to race there again next weekend, with a week to analyze the data they gained, I'm sure they would win the race, but that isn't how this sport works. You have to be perfect at the first time of asking. There are no second chances. This specific car will only ever race a track once. If you get it wrong, that's it, game over. Max Verstappen and Red Bull have bordered on infallibility this season, but Formula 1 is too complex for anyone to be perfect. Just like it did to Mercedes in 2015 and 2019, the unique challenges of Singapore caught Red Bull out. The rest have caught up to them somewhat. The flexi parts probably did make a little difference. The safety car on lap 20 ruined their strategy. This all added up, but the straw that broke Red Bull's winning run was the car setup. Wasn't the Singapore Grand Prix an amazing race? And do you think Red Bull will lose again this season? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and until next time, drive safe and bye for now.